Woke. Woke is a term that bothers me. Like, it doesn't bother me bad, like it doesn't make me angry, but it grates my teeth. It's like a high-pitched keening that hurts, at the root of the teeth and the gums. And the reason it bothers me isn't because of the idea that they're somehow woke from a dream. That's fairly standard mystical nomenclature. What bothers me about it is that it's the wrong word. It's just not English to say I am woke. Woke is a verb in the past tense, as in I woke from sleep, or she was woke from a dream. But it's also an antiquated and incorrect way to say the word. In fact, he was woken. I am woken. There's an N at the end of that word, and there's actually an A at the beginning. Awoken. Awoke. I am awake. Awake is the word. It's not woke. Woke is poetic, artistic license. And if what you're trying to tell me is that your worldview takes poetic, artistic license with its own nomenclature, its own name, your worldview isn't real. Your worldview is bad and it's wrong.
Knock, knock.
What do you want?
I have something to give you, and then I was going to take the dog out the door.
English is the point, isn't it? Because what we're talking about is African American vernacular English, and whether you believe or agree that vernacular, or AAVE, as it is known, AAVE, whether you agree that it should be considered or classified a separate language or not, it shouldn't. Doesn't matter what I think, what you think on AAVE doesn't matter, because what you and I think doesn't really matter about anything. We don't have enough money to have enough power, to have enough say to matter when we speak. That's why we're doing this. That's why I'm speaking into this microphone and you're listening, right? But not actually being English is the point. Because until, I don't know, about the 1960s, being English was a different thing from being American. See, we so thoroughly eradicated the idea, or the idea was so thoroughly incorporated into the American ethos, that we no longer know that there was once a hyphenated American discussion in our country. There was a heated and intense discussion in our country for probably about a century. Maybe more, I don't know. I'm not an American historian, and I don't really like the history of my country. I don't really care about it. But largely because it's predictable from where we're at. You can see it and go, well, I bet these things happened, and then you educate yourself a little bit, and then you go and read or learn about American history, and it's like, oh, yep, lo and behold, that exact thing that I thought happened is what happened, and this is why. But before about the 1960s, everyone was a hyphenated American, or could be considered a hyphenated American, because only the natives were native to this country, and even that is a conversation that had to play out in American politics. The nativist party were those white people who settled here first, or whose families settled here first, and therefore had native interests in the direction of American politics, and their opponents eradicated them by pointing out that the only natives to this continent and to this country are the indigenous or Native Americans. And we did our best, and were doing our best at the time of that argument, to eradicate them. The term wouldn't be invented yet, but to in fact genocide them. But we act today, and this is a side point, but it is a good point, because it's getting to what I'm trying to actually get to, which is the descendants of American slaves. Genocide was an extremely normal thing in human history before the 20th century. Historians, modern historians, or modern commentators, people without much knowledge about anything before the modern or the immediately pre-modern eras, maybe the post-Renaissance, is that genocide is the way that things were done on every landmass in the planet, among every people, civilized or uncivilized. And that word is insultingly broad, civilized, but everyone did it. Because you didn't want the people, you wanted the land. Because the land is where the resources were. It was only with the 18th century and the what do they call it? The African slave trade. I'm not going to try to remember what the company and what the industry is called, but the African slave trade was a result of having more land than people to work it. And so they had to take people from a place that had more people than resources to work and food to feed. They took those people and they employed them in low-paying, unethical jobs, because if they didn't, someone else was going to. So let's talk about the conversation of AAVE, because what AAVE is, if you take it from my perspective, AAVE is a dictionary or a glossary of commonly used artistic license aphorisms. So to say, I am woke, is to just speak the language wrong. It's just to speak the language ignorantly without being educated. And before you get all upset, ignorant just means to not know something. It doesn't mean to be stupid. So a lot of people, when I tell them, or when you hear someone else tell them, you're ignorant on this topic, or you're behaving ignorant, or what you're doing suggests that you are ignorant. We're not saying you're stupid. We're saying that you have ignored the fact that you don't know what you're talking about before you started speaking. To be ignorant or to be uneducated are an insult if you have held yourself up as somebody who has thought about the world, as somebody who is a scientific or otherwise thinker. And so to be ignorant is an insult if you are in fact ignorant but don't want anyone to know. It's not an insult if it's just true. So anyway, I don't want to just call people ignorant. That's unkind. The argument for AAVE is that because of racial segregation, because of the history of the slave trade and the North Americas, specifically in the United States, black people have developed, or African American people, because that particular subgroup seems to have either been, how do I say this? They seem to either have managed to remain ignorant of the hyphenated American argument that their white and Asian peers had in the 50s and 60s and 70s and before, or they're insisting on old terminology because it's beneficial to them. Which is wildly interesting, because people who insist on AAVE, and I know that I'm talking around the topic, but I'm showing you an example of how holistically this worldview doesn't work. They'll tell you that you're not allowed to call them colored, or that you're not allowed to use the N-word, or that really you're not even supposed to call them African Americans anymore, but they refer to their culture, the subset of them that insists on AAVE being a real thing. You're not allowed to do it from the outside because it's, and I hear young people, especially college students, say this very frequently, that's old terminology, that's outdated, it suggests racism. But African American is right there in the terminology of the vernacular English of the language. So if it's a real thing, then the naming the race, the language itself suggests racism of the people who name it thus. So let's just get right out and say it. And on a meta, from a meta standpoint, what we're talking about it's not black people, and it's not even broadly ignorance, and it's not even broadly the language. When I'm using the language for shit, I forgot the word. I don't want to talk about, it's not that I want to talk about cognitive dissonance. I want to talk about how the liberal worldview is manipulative of the people who adopt it. Because the people who adopt it aren't the people, so to speak, in control of it. And the people in control of the liberal worldview aren't liberals. They don't practice the liberal worldview. They practice another worldview. They practice, if you can call it anything, they practice a more esoteric worldview. But anyway, the idea is that the language is the result of however many 100 years of slave trade. But the slave trade, and why these people who want to say that, like, well, Africa's population would have been this many billions of people more populous or whatever, what they're ignoring, and what everyone who complains about or is ugly about, or who wants to say that anyone needs to be repaired for that slave trade, and sure, inhuman things happen, and injustices happen when inhuman things happen, and narcissistic psychopaths create a worldview that, how do you say this, that allows you to translate the trauma of doing inhuman things to human people. Those things can all be true. But it's also true that those people who were sold as slaves were captured in war. And so what happens to captives in war is that they lose their humanity. Because war is a descendant of, really it's a descendant of cattle ranching from our very, 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 very earliest human ancestors. I'm talking 100 to 200,000 years ago. Our very earliest human ancestors figured out how to domesticate, or at least how to follow horses, packs of horses, how to ranch them, exactly like cowboys did and do in the American West. It's the exact same tradition. It's not similar, it's the exact same. In fact, before the 6-shooters, it was even about as effective. Arrows, obsidian arrows, and the weapons and tools that our very, very earliest, and I could keep saying varies, our very earliest ancestors had were equally as sophisticated as those muskets and those rifles. They just were. Because humans take our natural resources, and we sophisticate the tools that we're able to make with them so that we can master our environments. All of these things are true, and they're all building to a point. They're all the same thing. I'm talking about the same thing. So the conflicts in the American West between United States or American ranchers and indigenous or Native American tribal peoples were, in fact, the exact same conflicts that were happening significantly more recently in human history. I mean, 5 to maybe 15, probably not that long ago, 1,000 years ago, with those domestic horses. Exact same conflicts. So, the conflicts between humans are the exact same conflicts. So, when they were going to war, and they were rounding up all of the people of the village whom they didn't kill in conflict, and selling the ones that they had captured in conflict, what they were doing was they were emptying the land. They were emptying the land of hostile people, because your village, your people, the people that you belong to, can never have too much land. Now, we know that that's not true, because you can be Spain and you can be England and you can be France, and you can suddenly have what seems like all the land in the world, and it's largely empty. But the reason that North America was largely empty was A, resources, and B, because of the way that the native peoples controlled their populations. The Spanish were absolutely horrified by what they found with the South American peoples. And today we humanize the South American peoples because the Spaniards they spent so much effort to dehumanize them. But if you look at them with an Enlightenment worldview, if you look at them with any kind of humanist sensibilities, they weren't human. Like in any way, the South Americans, the Mayans, I think, that's just not human. Even if the 80,000 people sacrificed as victims from war, from conquest, people captured as the result of war, and 80,000 people over 2 days sacrificed by having their hearts ripped out atop this pyramid, lined up the steps one by one. Take one more step, walk across the platform, get your heart cut out. 80,000 people, even if that's exaggerated, even if it was 8,000 people, even if it was 800 people, even if it was 8 people, by the standards set by humanism and by the Abrahamic faiths that have extended, not just the Abrahamic faiths, actually, the Indo-European faiths that have extended from the Asiatic coast, China and Korea, all the way to west to the Atlantic. That ethos of not killing one another in the name of a sky deity, that's very recent in human history, but both of these continents of Europe and Asia, I'm not in either of those continents, I'm seeing them in my mind, trying to remember their names, is why I said it that way, that both of those continents agreed that this can't happen. Human sacrifice and as population control can't work. So what they came to was chattel slavery and genocide. Because to circle back around, what they wanted was the resources of the land. They wanted the natural and they wanted the mineral, is what I'm trying to say. They wanted the mineral resources, but they also wanted the etc. natural resources, which in modern thinking is like oil or like natural gas, right? Various metals, but to them would have been sources of fresh, clean water, because water is just not easy to find when you're not in Africa. And I winced when I said that. I'm not on camera. And when you're not in North America, or South America is very plentiful with water. And the plenitude of the water in South America is why the North and South Americans had different solutions to their populations. The South American jungles were explosive with life, with natural resources, including animal food. Because see, one of the things that you have to think about when you're talking about the conflict between these rancher-type peoples and settled peoples near sources of water is that the settled people, their food came from the plants that they were able to cultivate. So the more plants they were able to cultivate, the better. Well, in order to cultivate plants, you need a lot of land, but not very many people. You can feed a lot of people with the work of very few people. And so you can have cities, and so you can have specialized labor, and you can have intellectual labor. And then intellectual labor can convince itself that it's more important than the manual labor creating the food, because there are so many more people who are literate when you have a steady supply of plant foods that you're able to cultivate. Equally, if you're a rancher type people, you need a huge amount of land, because grazing cattle require an enormous amount of land. And likewise, you don't need very many people. You can support enough people to defend yourself from equally sized groups of people with a manageable herd of livestock, whether it be horses or cattle or sheep or goats or whatever. I mean, we see it. You don't need me to tell you these things like they're the first time you've ever heard it. Like, it's increasingly obvious to me that no one else has heard the story of David and Goliath. But like, David is a shepherd, and as a shepherd, David is a nomadic and herding people who need a huge amount of uncultivated land. And David is at war with Goliath, who is a Philistine. And whether he is or 8 or 15 or 100 or 1,000 feet tall doesn't matter, because Goliath isn't one person that David fought. Goliath is an army. And it's a Goliath, or enormous army of people, because the Philistines were a settled Canaanite people who had farms. And so they had a professional class of people who were fed by those farms. And that professional class of people were not the soldiers. They were, in fact, the bureaucrats and the autocrats. But they were able to get huge amounts of semi-professional soldiers together. And with the threat of Goliath armies of semi-professional soldiers, what they were able to do was threaten the ranchers into doing what they wanted. Exactly the same way as the North American colonies were able to ultimately settle the North American continent. It wasn't through superior arms. It was simply through superior numbers. They were able to fill the cities with enough people that the rancher Native Americans, not the Native Americans on the Atlantic coast, actually were largely settled. They weren't like what we think of with the plains, and again, air quotes, Indians. But that's not the point. They were ultimately able to fill their cities with enough bodies, with enough people, many of those people stolen from foreign continents or bought from foreign continents, because in fact, whites weren't going into Africa with guns and soldiers and Goliath armies and relocating villages. What they were doing was sending 1 or 2 or 3 groups of individual merchants. Well, what they were doing was sending 1 or 2 or 3 or 10 or whatever, small numbers of individual merchants who then had semi-professional, armies, not Goliaths by any means, and they were taking weapons and natural resources to the tribes in Africa who were dominating or who were winning the wars, and they were taking the proceeds of the winning of the wars, because the people wanted the land, and they didn't really want to kill or genocide one another, because killing is traumatic. But pointing a gun at someone and saying, all right, I own you now, and then getting a bunch of money, or in fact more guns, or even better, ammo for those guns as a result of not killing that guy but giving him to this other guy, so that the guy that you didn't kill can continue to live, even if it's in uncomfortable or difficult labor in a different land. It's better than being dead. And so, however long I've been talking since about the 4-minute mark, 20 minutes. The last 20 minutes has been a relativistic argument in favor of African slavery as population management or population relocation, as opposed to population depletion through genocide. Because that's what we're talking about. because genocide wasn't invented in the 20th century in Europe. It wasn't invented in Europe, and it wasn't invented in the 20th century. Genocide was invented when the first group of humans ran out of land, had too many people, and wanted the land of a less populous people. That's when genocide was invented. So it was probably invented before there were even Homo sapiens sapiens. A lot of people want to think that maybe Homo sapiens sapiens extincted Homo sapiens neanderthalis through genocide, but that doesn't appear to be the case. What appears to be the case is that, like the Saxons and the Angles misplaced or displaced or just became more populous than the Bretons in southern Britain, and that looks like an erasure, or it looks like a genocidal replacement. What it is, in fact, is a becoming more populous than. I don't know if there's a word for that. But they didn't replace the people. The people remained there. The Neanderthals remained in wherever they were, Europe, right? There were just fewer of them than of their human cousins. There were just fewer Bretons in the immediate area that the Angles and Saxons settled in, and the ones who remained, the Bretons or the Neanderthals who remained, their children just weren't Breton or Neanderthal anymore. And then their children weren't half Breton or half Neanderthal anymore, and then their children weren't a quarter Breton. And then you get to where we are, and it's like whatever, 1.5% of the human genome is Neanderthal, right? And you get to, and you start digging around in the genetics of English burials and modern English people, and it turns out that it's about right if there was a population mixing and not a population replaisure. And so what wasn't happening in Africa, and what isn't happening with the AAVE, is that African people were not done a historical injustice beyond any other surviving people. And AAVE is not a real language. So I think that the argument is that AAVE is supposed to be like a pigeon or a, I don't remember what they call those. I think it's a composite language. I think that the idea is supposed to be that. But those languages, pigeons and composite languages, I believe, are the nomenclature. I'm not an expert. I've only read a book on it or taken a class on it, as college students are so want to give themselves expertise because they took a class on a thing. Composite and pigeon languages are so groups of people who don't share a common language can communicate and can effectively have a working economy. And when you have an effective working economy, what you have is peace. And so what pigeon and what these languages, the goal is to have peace. Because when you don't share the same language, you don't share the same kind of humanity. Right? So if men can get upset at each other over nothing, and women can get upset at one another over nothing, it's very easy to get upset over things like using the wrong word, like calling yourself woke when you mean awake, right? I could very easily be angry, and it would be very easy for me because it is an assault on my language, right? I do speak this language, and because I do speak this language, and by speaking it have whatever degree of mastery over it that I have, it is mine in that sense. And in that sense, it's also yours. And because we share it, right, we share certain assumptions, and assumptions that we don't even know that we share, right? So I began this by saying that AAVE isn't English, and then I continued by saying that not being English is the point. And I don't mean not being the language that we call English. What I mean is not being like the people whom we call English. Because the people whom we call English, there's this bias in the English language that the people whom we call English are also the people whom we call white. Because in this language, to be white doesn't mean to have white skin. To be white means to be pure. It means to be good. So when I said earlier that AAVE is bad, right? What the language is doing is saying, well, this is a black language. This is in fact an evil or a bad or a ignorant or an uneducated or an unclean or in whatever way bad or poor language. There are an infinitude of words that mean black and that mean white. I mean, that's why the Taoists, that's why Lao Tzu was very clear about the yin and the yang, right? The yin and the yang. The circle with the two moving the two moving circles within it that imply half circles that kind of look like a teardrop, and then the opposite colored circle on the inside implying a spherical spinning moving object. So two spherical spinning moving objects moving in space opposite them, locked in tandem forever. I mean, it sounds an awful lot like the helix, the double helix structure of DNA, or it sounds an awful lot like the moon and the planet Earth, or our planet, or or any individual planet and its sun, or any sun and its supermassive black hole at the center of its galaxy, or the supermassive black hole at the center of the galaxy of any individual galaxy, and honestly the supermassive black hole of any other galaxy, or just the center of the very universe. This is an abstraction that moves up and down, and it works because it moves up and down, up and down, up and down, up and down, like a singular pole. So like, I'm way off track by saying this, but people like Jordan Peterson, but not specifically Jordan Peterson, the people that Jordan Peterson is aping when he does comparative mythology. I'm struggling to remember his name, so I'm going to continue talking around it. But, oh my God, the hero with 1,000 faces. Joseph Campbell. People like Joseph Campbell are impressed by the idea of the totem pole, or the world pole, or the world totem, or like this one pole that represents being and unity in the world. But what they don't understand is that one pole is a manifestation or an abstraction if we're not actually talking about totem poles, or we're not actually talking about towers, right? Or what are those damn things in Egypt called? What are those damn things in Egypt called? Obelisks, right? They say that these represent like an abstraction of like of a world pole, right? And that the world pole is in some way like the world tree, and that the world tree in some way like represents hierarchical order, but they're just dead ass wrong about that. What it is it's an it's a pole, like a pole, a totem pole, or a tower, or a pole, like metaphorically what these things are, is they're an abstraction of an idea that works at every level of abstraction. So like a tower, like the Tower of Pisa, I know it's leaning, right? But when you're standing at the top of it, it's the same, it works. The tower functions for you as stander at every level of the tower. Every level of abstraction. That's what that means. It's an idea that works, that has a through line, like an electric power cable, right? It has a through line that works forward and back, up and down at every level. It doesn't, like a Christmas tree light, right? Like a string of Christmas tree lights, right? Like if there's a blockage in the flow of electricity, all the lights won't turn on, right? That's a working idea. And what I'm telling you is that AAVE and this whole idea of insisting on African Americans being a different people inside the American people, different and special people within the American people. A new Jerusalem is in fact the idea. They want desperately to be in exile in Babylon. They want desperately to be this diasporic people, diasporic. And it's a hurtful thing to say, but they're not. First of all, the Jews are unique in that they know where they came from. They maintain that story in a particular kind of unspecific specificity that allows them to remain a common people. Excuse me, to remain a common people in diaspora. Which is unusual, because once a people go into diaspora, they just become absorbed by the greater people. In exactly the same way as what I was talking about when a greater people move into an area and absorb the less populous people. When a people are shattered by war or whatever reason, and they're removed and isolated from the land and one another, they just incorporate themselves into the land eventually. In no small way like Asian immigrants into the United States. So one of the reasons that Asian racism or racism against Asians right now in the United States is so insidious is because good, well-meaning English-speaking people believed that because Asians are good, well-meaning English-speaking people, and by that I mean they're good citizens who assimilate rapidly and happily. They want to be Americans. That's why they came here. Good, well-meaning Americans have just allowed them to, they've allowed themselves to remain ignorant to the fact that universities and corporations are now, again, discriminating against Asian people because Asians are too American. And we're allowing it to happen because we thought that because they were the most American of us, it wouldn't happen to them. Surely it couldn't happen to them. Again, I mean, it did happen to them. We did enslave Chinese people. Like, let's not act like the Japanese weren't put in internment camps. But we assumed that because we had come out the other side of the hyphenated American, that because they weren't Chinese and because they weren't Japanese and because they weren't Korean and because they weren't Laos Americans, Vietnamese Americans, I don't want to etc. your entire country, but there are a lot of you. Because they weren't hyphenated Americans, because they were American Americans. They were Americans first and Americans last. They're a target. But so, that's why white people have a target on their back, right? Is for being Americans first. And that's why not being English is the point of AAVE. Because whether you're average AAVE speaking or believing or whatever, American believes it or not, the anger isn't with Americans. Like, the black anger isn't with America. Their anger is with England and the East Indies Company, or whoever the fuck it was. And the reason that they're demanding reparations and that they're demanding to be given a booster seat or to be given better shoes than their opponents so that they can run with maybe a little bit more comfort, if not faster, right? The reason that they want these things isn't because they think that America did them wrong. What they think is that America stood by and didn't do anything. And so because they didn't do anything for so long, they're somehow owed interest now that America is doing something. But America used to be a meritocracy, so the reason that America didn't do anything, and the reason that America continues to not do anything, is because nobody gets reparations for what the English did to them. We're all of the white people that are here because some monarchy did them wrong. Whether that monarchy was a king of France or Spain or Germany or one of the monarchies in Italy, or the Pope, or a demagogic priest, they were coming here for freedom. And they didn't just get freedom. Like, it wasn't just given to them. So, like, you'll hear conservatives make this point a lot, that a lot of people fight and die to preserve American freedom. And in fact, the American Armed Forces have, since at least the 1960s, done more to endanger American lives and American freedom than, in fact, they have to protect it. But that's unimportant, because it is true that at one point, our ancestors, if you live here, whether it was your direct ancestors of blood or your cultural heritage is of people who fought and who died to preserve their right to speak English and to preserve their religious and secular freedoms from tyranny. And so what I'm telling you right now is that AAVE is wrong. It's a bad worldview. We've already built out how it's a bad worldview. It doesn't work at every level of abstraction. You can't speak scientifically and you can't speak clearly in AAVE. And more importantly, AAVE wasn't designed to communicate with people outside of the AAVE speaking community. It was designed within the community to isolate the community from outside. That is not a language. That is a code. That's a cant. That's a religion. That's a worldview. And that's the point. If you believe the AAVE worldview, you believe that you aren't as good as your non-AAVE speaking people because you're ignorant and you know you're ignorant. And being aware of one's ignorance is the worst kind of awareness, especially when one knows that one's language can't fill the gaps between what you know you don't know and what you don't know you don't know. And we're going to talk about what woke means and what it means to be awake, and by we I mean I. So let's pause there and let's transition. Let's talk about darkness. Let's talk about what ignorance and what whiteness and what blackness. Ignorance and knowledge, knowledge, or the characteristic of knowing, right? And knowing is certitude, right? And certitude is measurable degrees of proof. So, like, the difference in a theorem, a theory, and a hypothesis. And a law, right? So you've got these different hierarchical ways of knowing, right? Of proving the degree to which you know something. So you've got a law, and the law is a law. It's always this way. There are no exceptions. And then a theorem is something to which you haven't found exceptions yet, but you also can't prove as a law for whatever reason. And then a theory is something to which you aren't sure, you don't know whether there are exceptions, but you're still testing for exceptions. You haven't run enough, you haven't run nearly enough, you haven't run enough of the nearly infinitude number of tests that it would require to become a theorem. And then a hypothesis is a guess. It's an educated guess. But a hypothesis is, in a lot of ways, the first throw in a javelin toss. Like, if you're trying to see how far you can throw a series of javelins, you want to know for certitude what your maximum range, or your average range even, with throwing javelins is. Like, the first javelin is your hypothesis. Well, this is about how far I figure I can throw it. And then your second hypothesis, or your second javelin, is testing the hypothesis. And that's the testing the hypothesis phase is also testing your ignorance. It's testing what you know you don't know. Moving back up the pole of abstraction, from theory, or from hypothesis, you go to theory, and you can start to develop a theory once you've thrown enough javelins to have some data. And it helps when you're developing a theory to have other people also throwing javelins. So like, if what you want to know is how far you can throw a javelin, and then how far you can throw a javelin on average, and then how far you can throw a javelin after you've thrown 100 javelins in a day, and then how many javelins you can throw after you've thrown 100 javelins in a day over the course of 100 days. Like, eventually there comes a point where your skills are going to decline because of age, right? Your ability to throw javelins is naturally going to decline. So you're gathering data, but you're gathering data about yourself. So if what you then want to know is, okay, well, what's the maximum potential for all human beings? Like, what is the maximum human potential for throwing a javelin? You're going to start to have to test a nearly infinitude of human beings, right? So then you have to get other human beings to also be testing, to also be observing. And whether you're observing the other human beings or you're getting the human beings to observe the phenomenon with you, you're developing a theory about the thing. And then, once you've got enough people testing it together, then other people can start to examine the data once you're gone. And then once you're gone, they can start to come to conclusions that work for them about it. And then there may or there may not be exceptions to it, but it works well enough to be a theorem. And then after long enough with the theorem, or with just a good enough proof of the hypothesis, you could jump straight to truth, right? So like, if we want to use a recent example, Albert Einstein with his theory of relativity, or Newton would be better because his are actually called laws, right? The laws of thermodynamics weren't Newton, but the laws of physics, like of gravity, etc. His heavenly bodies, like, those are laws because they can't not be true. So, the difference abstractly between a theorem and a law, then, as you're moving back up, is that the law can't be untrue. It can't have an exception. It is impossible for there to be exceptions, but written into laws, as we know with quantum physics, are the exceptions for their laws, because every good law has contingency. We know that from the history of politics. Just the history of human governance, which is what we've been talking about in a lot of ways. So if knowledge then is darkness, if it's abstract darkness, if ignorance is abstract darkness, so imagine that you are camping. You're not in any actual danger, but you are in an unknown and an unfamiliar and a hostile environment, and it's night. It's perfectly night. There have never been stars invented for the purpose of our stupid thought experiment. And the moon doesn't exist for whatever reason. It's just perfectly dark where you are. If you have any amount of knowledge, any whatsoever, that's a campfire. Just anything that you know is true, that you can know with certitude, because, again, knowledge isn't what you think you know. Knowledge isn't what you've heard, and it's not what you've been told. It's what you can know with certitude. And what you can know with certitude are things at or above the theorem level of our totem pole. You can know for certain laws of nature, and you can know for certain things that other people have tested over the course of centuries or millennia to be true. Those things you can know with certitude. Those things you can say, we know they're self-evident. And that's important, especially when we're talking about the context of AAVE, which is a religion, which is a worldview. And so when you're talking about a religion, and when you're talking about a worldview, you're talking about the things that you hold to be self-evident. Because the things that you say and the way that you say them indicate the things that you hold to be self-evident. The things that you just assume are true. the things that you believe you have certitude about. And there is a difference in having certitude and believing that you have certitude. Because believing that you have certitude is a little bit like having a match versus having a campfire and extra fuel. You can have multiple matches, but that match will burn your fingers if you're not careful. If you let what you believe is true get too close to you, it will absolutely always burn you. It will always be wrong. Always. It will always leave you in a position where you're wrong and in danger because of it. For instance, to our example of our hostile and unfriendly place that it doesn't have any immediate dangers present, would you rather have the campfire that provides heat and on which you can feed yourself, or a match? The match is good for starting certitude. What you think you know is a good place to light the kindling of what you know for certain. So your language is a good place to start. And so there are some things that you can know for certain about your language. And you can know for certain where it came from, how it evolved, who speaks it, and how you were taught the language. And there is a fact about language, and it's that complex languages have to be taught to children. English is an extremely complex language. I don't know if it's the most or if it's in the top 10 of complex languages. I know that Estonian is apparently in the top 10 of complex languages. But you have to teach the language. And what that means is that you have to teach the complexity of the worldview. You have to teach the sophistication of the worldview, right? AAVE is a woke language. And what that means is that it's an intuitive language. What that means is that it doesn't and it can't be taught. You can't teach someone to speak AAVE correctly. So if we're thinking of this like a Dave Chappelle sketch, and you've got your guy with his white voice, and you've got your guy talking AAVE, or what used to be called jive, or what used to be called street, or what used to be called all number of things, because it was understood to be a slang, and it was understood to be not a sub-language, but a way of speaking the language that was regional and, associated with crime and violence, frankly. In exactly the same way that New York Italian used to be associated with crime and violence, and in exactly the same way that Irish, the Irish accent when spoken in English, is associated with crime and violence. In exactly the same way that the Southern accent is associated with backwardness, ignorance, and stupidity. And I don't remember what I was saying. The implication when you say that you were woke. Let's go back to our metaphor, our visual metaphor, because I think that I covered everything that I wanted to cover. The light of your certitude includes what you know, and then there's a twilight just beyond the radius of what you know. That half light of what you don't know. And in that half light, that liminal you don't know space is where monsters lurk. Everybody has had the experience of thinking that they have seen a human shape where there shouldn't be in low light, turned on the light, and either there wasn't anything there, or it was like a jacket that you forgot was there, right? And that's a phenomenon of the human brain, which is, has structures in it designed to see human parts and human faces, and to see danger in low light where it's not. And the reason that you have that is because what you know that you don't know is equally dangerous to you as what you don't know. So you can't know that you don't know. You can't know if you don't know that there's a tiger and the ultimate darkness beyond the twilight of what you don't know. You can't know that. And you don't know whether the tiger that you think you see and what you can't really see is real until your campfire gets big enough to encompass that radius. So you stretch what you are certain about into more topics. You increase what you're certain about to cover a larger area, or you take a brand from that campfire and you make a torch, and then you carry that torch out into the darkness. And now civilization is exactly the same as being an individual person. So what civilization does is civilization carries a potentially infinite over time number of torches out into the darkness, and then it builds new campfires. And then it builds light posts. And then it illuminates the darkness, metaphorically, but also literally. One of the great human achievements was being able to light the night with electricity. It came with the promise that the night was no longer going to be dangerous for women. So now we have a working model of what it means to know something with certitude, what it means to not know something with certitude, and what it means to be unaware that you don't know something at all. Being a human individual, you can either build that central circle up, or you can carry torches out into the darkness where you can meet other torchbearers, and then you can rely on their certitude to light up areas of your uncertitude. And so in that way, abstractly and literally, as individuals and as a society, we need other individuals and we need other society. So when I'm talking about AAVE, and I'm talking about knowing what you don't know and lighting up the darkness, what I'm talking about is, again, demonstrating that the language doesn't help its speakers. It doesn't help its speakers because it doesn't allow them to communicate with people outside the language. In fact, being inside the language is to gatekeep people from without, from directly understanding you. Because you're speaking in aphorisms and you're speaking with artistic license. You're using words to mean things other than what they mean. And so what that means is when you're speaking with AAVE, you're intentionally misrepresenting reality. Now see, in old language, good English, but also just good Indo-European or even Proto-Indo-European, what we wouldn't say is that you're misrepresenting the truth, or that you're misrepresenting reality, or that you're sharing your subjective experience. What we would say in good antique language is that you are lying. Misrepresenting reality is a lie. And so one of the things that the AAVE community, or those people who control that community, want to do is they want to say that they're the lost 13th tribe of Israel. Right? They want to say that they're they want to say that their language is a Hebrew descendant. Well, the Hebrew is a Canaanite language, and Canaanite is an Indo-European language. And so if they're trying to say that they're a Hebrew language and that they're an Indo-European people, what they're trying to say is that they're not, in fact, African, but they are, in fact, Iranian or Indo-Iranian, that they're from India or Afghanistan or Iran or, Europe. Indo-European. Indo-European means everything between China and the Atlantic Ocean. And that doesn't include Africa. So because they don't know where they came from, they don't know what they don't know, they have to invent stories for themselves. And so they have to invent a story of a language. So they have to rely on artistic license. They have to rely on, frankly, a old and discarded way of thinking. Not just thinking about oneself or thinking about one's culture, or one culture thinking about itself or thinking about its greater connection to human cultures. I don't remember what I said before that. So to be awoke is the idea of woke, the idea of being awake, comes from basically what I'm saying. They're trying to connect themselves to an intellectual and a spiritual tradition that's not their own. They're trying to say that they're Indo-European, but they're African. They came from Africa. Their ancestors were African. Their ancestors didn't think like Indo-Europeans. Their ancestors weren't Egyptian. Their ancestors weren't Mediterranean, right? Even the Nubians, even when they conquered southern Egypt, weren't Egyptian. They were Nubian, and they lived and built in Egyptian styles, and they used Egyptian artists because Egyptians didn't go away just because their ruling class were Nubian now. But the ruling class were still Nubian. They were still culturally Nubian. They were still ethnically Nubian. They were still racially Nubian. They were still genetically Nubian. They still looked like Nubians. They thought of themselves as Nubians. They spoke a different language. They were a different people. And so the idea then is that AAVE sets black people up as a different people. So they're speaking a different language. They're a different people. But their language and the way that the language expresses itself is, we're talking like a 7,000-year-old worldview and means of expressing itself. We're talking like the way that they talk and the way that they express themselves and the way that they utilize artistic license is pre-Gilgamesh. We're talking pre-civilizational, like as we would understand it. We're talking proto-human. And so what they're asking us to do, in a broader sense, the black community, they're asking us to let them reinvent civilization within our civilization, because they've read in the Bible that the Hebrew people were able to, or they've been taught that the Hebrew people were able to reinvent civilization from within civilization. So what they're trying to do is they're trying to model themselves as the 13th tribe of Israel, and they're trying to reimagine the United States as Babylon. And so one of the things I take for granted that everybody knows is that Hebrew was a language that did in fact die, but that should have died 300 years before it did. Something like that. Because the exile in Babylon is significantly more recently than I realize. I think that it was I want to say it was 100 BC, because I want to say that Julius Caesar in the 60s, when he was in conflict with the Israelis, they were already Persian. And the Babylon only lasted 40 years or something. It was really it was what we would consider one modern generational cohort. It was only 2 groups of adults. So in 40 years, you'll have the people who were born in exile would have been 40 when they were released, right? Which means that they would have been grandparents, which means that there were only 2 generations of Jews that actually experienced exile. And so what the blacks are trying to do is they're trying to, this black community, which I don't think is black people, I do think is a very, 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 very small group of maybe 10 black people with black skin color who identify themselves as black. But whether what I think of them is irrelevant. I think that this is an insidious thing being done to ordinary black people, and that it's an example of how ordinary black people can be controlled by a very small group of black people across the world. Because again, what they're trying to do is reinvent civilization within civilization. When civilizations reinvent themselves, what they do is they incorporate themselves into a larger group of people that they have no connection with. So when the Romans wanted to invent themselves again as the post-senatorial Romans, what they did, and what I mean by they is what Augustine, is that his name? Augustine is the writer. Caesar Augustus. Look, they only had like 4 names. Cut me some slack. Caesar Augustus, what he did was he commissioned the poet Virgil to rewrite the history of Rome artistically, that is, using artistic license and artistic language. And so what I mean by that is doing it metaphorically, right? Connecting the Roman Empire back to the battles, or back to the time of Homer, and back to the Battle of Troy, back to the war between the Greeks, or whoever they actually were, and the Trojans, or whoever they actually were. And there were not Romans at that battle, and no Roman hero went to Carthage, and no Roman hero seduced and ruined Queen Dido, and then no Roman hero, having seduced Queen Dido, settled in Italia. That just didn't happen. It didn't happen. But for 1900 years, human beings just believed that it did. They just believed it. Just because it was written down in a story with, this great and wonderful artistic license language, they just believed it. Why wouldn't it be true? Somebody took all this time to write it. And, that's the case of the Bible, too. The Bible takes a lot of artistic license with history. Like Moses probably happened, and the exile out of Egypt probably happened, but it didn't happen when they said it did, and it definitely didn't happen in the exact ways that it did, right? And David probably definitely did become king of Israel by fighting or defeating a Goliath army by winning a contest in single combat, because that's how things were done. But it was probably also a political arrangement where he wins in single combat, and they're like, okay, well, you're this kid and leader of this mercenary army, and your king is a coward, so we will go and depose the king and make you king. And all of these things are wrapped up in language of divine right, because the people who wrote and told the story were the people who were motivated to tell the story like the person in power has the divine right, because the priestly class, the educated people who rely on the farmers and the soldiers to remain in power, they can only praise the person currently in power. That's why it's only later in the books that you start to see people who are considered insane, the prophets, criticizing the kings. But they're only able to do that because, again, they've given themselves the divine right that kings used to have. So anyway, they're trying to reinvent civilization. And so what they've done is they've connected themselves historically back to the Bible, to the Hebrews. They're a lost tribe of the Hebrew people. And so they're all one people, because a lost tribe of the Hebrew people can then have further levels of diasporic abstraction, because like the Ashkenazi Jews, just to take a name of a group of Jews that I've heard recently and know literally nothing about, they can trace their history back to a certain place. That's why they know their genetic purity and why there's a name for it. And so when you don't know the name for your genetic purity, and you don't have a genetic purity because you're people from hundreds or thousands of different tribes over the course of an entire continent, and it's hilarious how it's hilarious to me how the idea of equal representation even goes to our maps, because Africa is fucking enormous compared to Europe. But if you look at maps, they seem like they're about the same size. But like what we think of as Egypt North, like the very northernest part of North, like pre-Saharan North Africa, is like the size of Europe. It's like bigger than Europe. The difference is that there's a great big fucking desert in the middle of northern Africa, and there aren't any deserts in Europe. So we're back to the same situation I was talking about before when we're talking about population versus the land and its resources. And see, in the world that we exist in today, what we don't have is too much land. What we do have is too many people to we have what we have is people. A lot of people, and so we figured out that we can throw people at problems. Historically, they used to throw people at problems. So you would empty the land, and then you would throw the people onto the land, and then when the land got too full of people, you would throw those people at another land, empty the land, etc. That's the way that the Indo-Europeans have done it. That's why the Nazis called back to the so-called Aryans, or noble race of people, because they basically laid the seed for the nobility of the entire Indo-European continent and subcontinent combination, however you want to say that. That entire area, that huge landmass, was settled by people that all spoke the same basic language, that all came with the same basic worldview, and that worldview was replace, overpopulate, replace, overpopulate, rinse, repeat, until there's no people that don't speak languages like yours, and then you do it to one another. And if you really think about Indo-European as a language group, and you really think about what happened to it, when the Indus River Valley civilization exploded, and those people were not black and they weren't African, and so they really don't have anything to do with AAVE, except insofar as to show how languages move around and what languages can be used to do. Some of the people that were in the Indus Valley civilization and spoke Indo-Iranian or Indo-European went east and became the Hindus and the Vedic authors of India, and were then replaced again by another Indo-European speaking people, the Aryans, right? Or noble race, who then established that the Vedas were the way that the noble or Aryan life was lived, and then that same worldview, that same kind of people, the Aryans, settled Europe. And so that's why the Nazis tried to track themselves back to that nobility that used to be so dominant in Europe, and that was occulted. It went underground, or it became hidden with the Protestant and French revolutions or reformations, whichever words you want to use. So they're trying to create their own civilization, and what they've done is they've created an environment where, because, let's call it white, or let's call it European, let's say it this way, because European civilization at the level of the nobility had become so white, and by that I mean pure and clean, and most importantly, polite, able to communicate intra and interlingually. What I mean is communicate with people who didn't speak the highfalutin language of the nobilities, but also the highfalutin language of foreign nobilities. So, like, being a rich person and living in the United States, you were still expected to speak French and Spanish and German at one point. You were supposed to have some fluency. Now, to be a rich person in America and to speak those languages, there's like what's wrong with you? But that was a slow evolution over the course of the post-American Revolution. But if you learn to speak English well enough to understand that what you're saying when you speak AAVE is largely nonsense and largely not what the words mean, you run into conflict. And it's the conflict between what woke means when they say it and what awake means when people who know what they're saying say it. So the idea comes from the Upanishads. The reason I'm talking about the Indo-Europeans and the people who went east into India and how they're not Africans and they weren't black and they're not Hebrew, and these people today who are insisting that AAVE is what it is because of the worldview that I'm about to lay out to you, they're not those people. They don't have that culture. They are culturally appropriating another people's ideas and worldview. The idea is that reality as we experience it, the campfire of what we are certain about is a dream. Because everything is self-evident, we know what we know for the same reasons that we know what we know in dreams. Now, we have reality testing functions in the brain, centers in the brain of which they were fully aware but didn't have a sophisticated enough language to talk about at the level that I'm saying, where they can dissociate from it and say reality testing. Because in a dream, what you can't do is test the reality. Because what happens when you're asleep and your brain is dreaming and you are whoever or whatever you are and are doing whatever you are doing in the dream is the result of the reality testing portions or function of your brain resting, turning off so that it can get a break. So if it's like a muscle, right, and I don't know that it's not like a muscle, a skill is like a muscle in that you get better at it and you get more automatic at it the better you get at it, and the longer that you use it, over time. Like in our javelin example, your reality testing center is like it's like your athleticism for throwing javelins into and testing them in the dark. I know that this is an extremely mixed and unclear metaphor, but I'm speaking and not writing, so you're just going to have to deal with that if you ever hear this. So when we're asleep, we're dreaming and we're unable to test the reality, but when we're awake, we're also dreaming, but we're able to test that reality. So from an abstract sense, nothing around you is real. What you see is just it's just a holographic projection inside your brain of what your eyes are taking in, what's out there. It's not there. So when you're touching it, you know, and you verify it's real because you're testing it by the triangulation sort of your eyes and the sense nerves of your fingers, right? So like there's a triangulation. I touch it, my eyes see that I'm touching it, and I can feel that I'm touching it, right? That's why like kind of like touching yourself is weird, especially like touching yourself on the nose, where your nose is like hypersensitive, so there are a lot of nerve endings there, and your brain is like knows specifically where on your nose you're being touched, but you can't see it. So there's like and you can feel it. Or like when a finger is numb, or like you have a numb part of your body and you touch it and you can feel the pressure and you can feel on the part of your body that's touching the part that's numb that you're touching it, but you can't feel that you're touching it because the part's numb. Anyway, that's reality testing. So like like amputees or people that have brain injuries, that have like phantom limbs or limbs that they dissociate from, that's your reality testing. It's a reality testing center of your brain having either an issue or doing what it's not, like glitching effectively. It's not a glitch, but it's effectively, it's not dissimilar. So the idea of being awake in the sense of the Upanishads, in the sense that woke is culturally appropriating, is to be aware that you're dreaming in the dream of reality. So you're awake in reality, but you're also awake to the fact that you're dreaming in reality. That's what it means to be awake. And what that means is to be hyper self-aware. It means that that your reality testing skill is so good that it's able to test your internal reality as well. The reality of you. The reality, in a sense, of God. I mean, it's that big. So AAVE is culturally appropriating this idea when they say that they're woke, or the woke community is culturally appropriating this idea when they say that AAVE is in fact a language. They're culturally appropriating the idea of being awake to the dream while within the dream. So what they're saying is that their campfire is all-encompassing. Not only that their certitude is of everything. And frankly, I find that insulting because my certitude is of everything. And that's me being ironic, because the next line is to say that my certitude is like Socrates, that I'm certain of nothing, and therefore I'm smarter and better than you. But that's a little bit nonsense. The reason he said that was so that they would kill him. Like, we tell that story to college students wrong. Or college students learn it wrong, because when you hear, philosophy students who, I took a class, they completely misunderstand what Plato is doing with Socrates. Plato's not telling history, he's not telling what actually happened, he's writing a fucking play, guys. It's a dialogue. It's Socrates, the novel, right? The Death of Socrates, the novel. It was a play. Well, it was an audiobook, is what it was, because it was read aloud. It wasn't, it was like reading didn't become sitting alone in the dark by yourself until the early Christian period. And even then, that was only among a group of scholars. A small group of people, that is to say. That's why in, early 20th century fiction, like Lovecraft, the characters are all shut-in bookworms. Because that was unusual. It was unusual to be a shut-in bookworm. In large part because reading it's not really a pleasant task. Reading, like thought, like meditation, it's concentrating on being still and imagining one thing for a long time. And that one thing actually changes frequently when you're talking about like a novel, right? So when, for me, just sharing something about me so that I don't seem like such an asshole, I read a lot of nonfiction. And reading nonfiction can be really frustrating when they're doing like what I do and they seem to be talking about things other than their core thesis. So it's like, what the fuck does Gilgamesh or what the fuck does any of this that I'm talking about have to do with why AAVE makes you feel any kind of way? Well, the reason it makes me feel any kind of way is because it's an invalid language, it's an invalid worldview that demands to be allowed to be doing its insidious and, frankly, extremely harmful activities in public. And so I reject that because civilization rejected that. So like if we're talking about the Upanishads, or we're talking about, even if we're talking about what every liberal's favorite, the Native Americans, you can't talk about AAVE if you're me and you know what I know and not talk about black magic. So, black magic and white magic have the same lingual source as the concept of white being clean and pure and black being unclean and impure. So if I'm going to talk about, and I'm going to relate everything to Indo-Europe and the ancient Indus Valley civilization, because I think for our purposes and speaking in the language that we're speaking and talking about what I'm talking about, and low key, because what I want you to take away from this, and maybe I should say this sooner, like if I were writing this, maybe I would like cut and paste this part to the opening instead of, I'm probably long past an hour in. How far am I? Yeah, an hour and a half. So the ultimate takeaway that I want you to take from this is, if you're a speaker of AAVE, or you're the kind of person who's on the fence about whether your politeness should override your righteousness, and your politeness should rarely override your righteousness. And what I mean by that is, if somebody pronounces your name wrong or calls you by the name wrong and you don't correct them, you're being polite. You're doing it to be polite. But if your politeness overrides your righteousness, that is, you're being right in what your name is actually, or what your name is actually, or how your name is actually pronounced, if you allow your politeness to override that righteousness, they will continue to mispronounce or misname you. And so, in a lot of ways, we're talking about that outrage that trans people feel when you misgender or dead name them. That's taking a position of righteousness, right? And so I don't know what the opposite of openness is, right? But if openness is politeness, I don't know what, like, would it just be closedness, or would it be impoliteness? I know that there's a psychological term for people who are not aggressive, they're just them. They just do them, right? And so it can come off as rude, or it can come off as impolite. There's a term for it, but I can't remember what it is. Directness, maybe? And so maybe what I'm doing is I'm saying that our politeness, that is white people, and I don't mean people of white skin. What I mean is people who are educated and who are concerned with the ignorance of others, and how that ignorance is harmful to them more than how it's harmful to the nominally white person. Because that's an abstraction. I'm talking about good people versus bad people. But if you look at, over the course of the last 40 years, if you look at the behavior of white people, it's been mostly women telling their men that they need to be polite to blacks and other non-whites because they feel guilty for them, because it was hard for them. It was harder for them. And then that became habitual, that you just, well, it was harder for my ancestors than it was for yours, and so you should be polite to me, to, well, it was harder for my ancestors, so you have to be polite to me, or you shall be polite to me. And there's a point where, you can ask for politeness, and it's like, okay, well, I'll begrudgingly give you this politeness, which is the same as panhandling, right? Like, what people want to do is people want to volunteer their help, because volunteering your help means that you have help to spare. And so in a sense, what that is having land to spare, right? And so you allow, in a sense, an abstraction from what I'm talking about, but allowing people to subsist on your land because you have it to share with these people who don't have it, is volunteering to help, right? But what people take umbrage with, with religion all the time, a lot of the reason, like myself, one of the things that I rejected Christianity was the tithing, the 15% tax. I have to pay a 15% membership fee to be in this club. That was exorbitant to me as I'm very poor. I have always been very poor. And 15% was exorbitant. I couldn't live giving 15% to God. But the point isn't that you're giving 15% to God, because what people don't understand until they get envious because they watch videos on YouTube of churches that pay off the debt of their humblest members, is that what we want to do is we want to be able to volunteer our help. And when we can volunteer our help, we get to decide whom our righteousness benefits. And if we get to decide, we get to choose whom our righteousness benefits, it feels good. It just feels better. There are other benefits, but the reason that we do it is because that is the one that feels the best, right? That's why in Africa, there are houses made out of boxes full of dehydrated milk, or at least there were when I was a boy reading the newspaper for social studies reports, trying to find the most interesting article to talk about. I'd read the whole fucking paper instead of just picking one at random like everybody else did. And I don't know why I did that. I did it for years, from 4th grade all the way through 10th grade. I did that same damn thing and gave good, thoughtful reports, and I always just got back checkmark that I had done the report. I don't know why I didn't give up sooner, but I was interested, and I don't know why I haven't given up on this sooner, because I'm not even allowed to talk about this, because the only racial mixture or admixture of which I'm aware is Native American, and I'm not going to claim it because I don't know any Shawnee people. They wouldn't claim me. I never met my great-grandmother. Anyway, I don't remember what I was talking about to get here. Righteousness and politeness. White people have been polite to black people for too long. I mean, that's just the case. It's like now we're talking about California's trying to give out reparations or whatever, and that's being forced to volunteer your kindness. And so we like to be able to volunteer it. We are willing to give it if it's mandated for a reason that we can agree with. And that's what I was talking about with tithes. So tithes are mandated kindness. So it's like the reason that you tithe to the church is exactly the same reason, and it's exactly the same in practice as why rich landowners in Israel were mandated by God, but mandated by the temple to give whatever 10 or 15% of their land, to leave it unharvested and unused in whatever way for poor and homeless people, right? So it's a mandate to help other people, and the way that you do that is that taxes, and it's sort of exactly the same as our current social welfare programs, is if enough people, if everyone gives, and everyone gives the same amount, or at least the same percentage or the same proportion of their income, then everyone is helping to the same percentage or the same proportion. Everyone is helping equitably, not equally, but everyone is helping. And so we're willing to tolerate taxes and mandates so long as everyone is helping, because everyone has the equal percent chance of benefiting. That's what I'm trying to get to. Where we're at now is we've created a situation where black people are no longer panhandling. They're no longer participating and hoping that their goodness will get them a voluntary escalation in society, whether by, the white savior, or the specific white savior, or because the church bailed them out, or a social organization, a friend, or whatever. They were bailed out. Which was the model that everyone followed in America. That is the American dream, is to work hard, pay your taxes, do your best to give your 15% until you're bailed out. You make your break, somebody elevates you. That's what happens. We act like, until you invent something or until you do something no. Your break is being noticed by someone rich. That's what happens. Or with the internet, until enough poor people subscribe at $1 a month on Patreon that you're able to buy a house, and now you're elevated out of poverty. Those are the business models, and those have always been the business models. The reason in English and in the United States we're so concerned with people like me who say black magic or religion or spirituality, or that talk a little too abstractly in the psychological, the reason that we're concerned with those people, or those people that have talked like that and talk like I do and think like I evidently think in the past, we have a name for those people, and it's charlatan. Those people are thieves. They're liars who make fabulous wealth off of poor people. And I'm not trying to make any money off this. Whatever. If I make any money off this, you'll think that I'm doing hate speech by telling you that you can speak AAVE, but you really need to learn your language. You just really need to master an actual language. If it's not English, let it be Spanish, or let it be Chinese, or let it be French. I don't care. Master a language. Until you master a language, you can't master thought. Until you master your thoughts, you can't master yourself. And until you master yourself, you're someone's slave. Someone's slave. And if the whole point of AAVE is to elevate an entire people out of slavery, it doesn't make sense to enslave yourself to the language. Because someone is master of it. Someone is master of the English language. Someone decides style. E.B. Strunk and White, they didn't write that book on style because there was no audience for it and because there was no publisher interested in telling everyone how to write in the same way. And his or their style rules, I think it was E.B. White. Is it E.B. Strunk? Is it Strunk and E.B. White? I don't remember. It doesn't matter. Strunk and White. Whoever was the original author, whichever one of them was the original author of the manuscript, he didn't write his rules because they were law. He wrote them because they were his theory on how to write well. And he was an elementary level English teacher, to my knowledge, and wrote Charlotte's Web. Like, we're not talking about somebody who, beyond writing on style, was a stylistic master of the English language, right? All he did was write a Pythagorean manifesto on the basic, not a Pythagorean, what's his name? A Euclidean manifesto on, or a Euclidean manifesto on the basics of the mathematics of grammar. I don't think AAVE even has its own particular grammar. And see, like, if you don't have your own particular grammar, you're not a language. Like, kind of like if you don't have meter and rhyme and various other things, I don't actually know the rules, you're not poetry. And so I described what awoke means. It means to be awoke from the dream. It means to have a campfire that encompasses all of reality, to know literally everything. Everything. Not some things, to have an answer that is right for everything. And so, from the basic lingual structure of saying that you are woke and not that you are awake, it's just a lie. They're not awake to everything. They don't know everything. In fact, their basic understanding of how racism works, how race works, how their own slavery works, their own history is wrong. It's just factually wrong. So what they are, in fact, is unwoke. To be woke is, in fact, to be asleep in reality. It's a paradoxical inversion of the possibility of language that makes my brain hurt, and it sets my teeth on edge. Just to say it, just to even, like, to try to articulate it, to think about it, just hurts me. And I'm not asking for pathos. I'm saying, like, if there's a why I'm doing this, it's because it does hurt me to hear people speak in this way. And it hurts me from a place of empathy, not because I'm insulted, but because I'm too polite, in a sense. I'm too aware of the damage that's being done by joining this cult of awokeness or of wokeness. But see, my thing is I don't actually know how to combat it, because I don't want to fight them. Because you can't fight someone awake. Enlightenment literally means lighting the darkness. It literally means expanding your personal campfire to encompass everything. And enlightenment is a personal process. Enlightenment isn't a process that you can get in a university, and it's not a process that you can achieve at the knee of a master. Enlightenment is a personal process. And so when I said that AAVE is black magic, like, there are a lot of people that are going to hear that, and they're going to hear, like, I'm saying, oh, it's like voodoo, or oh, it's like hoodoo, or oh, it's all of these various things that Christians and white people have accused, African sub-races of for time immemorial. But black magic is a thing. It's real. And it is a thing practiced by the antecedents of those people who were made slaves. I mean, hoodoo and voodoo and the various other sub-African magic systems or black magic systems. Because I don't think voodoo is black magic. I don't think voodoo is exclusively black magic. Or maybe it's that voodoo is, I don't know. Either voodoo is all black magic or hoodoo is all black magic. One of them is all black and one of them is all white, I think. Or one of them is gray and the other is all black. I don't know. I've stayed ignorant of this in large part because the AAVE or the black or the African American community have said that it's not white people's place to know. But what I'm learning about that is the black magic aspect of what I'm talking about. And so without talking about black magic, without actually talking about magic, what it is saying, well, you're not allowed to look at this because when you look at it, you shine a light on it. And when you shine a light on it and you know things about it and then you tell other people about it, the lie to, the blanket or the screen or the what was the Wizard of Oz behind? I guess he was behind a screen or a curtain, right? Like you rip that curtain off. And so for a while, I noticed, a while isn't really the way to say it because I never participated in this, but for a long time in my life, I observed the scientific skeptic community because I was trying to figure out what cult I wanted to join, because you have to join a cult. That seems to be the rule, is that you're supposed to join a cult. Thou shalt not join a cult, but thou really ought to, is kind of the commandment. And so I was observing scientific skepticism. And one of the things that I noticed about scientific skepticism is that there's a glee there in ripping the curtain off of the Wizard of Oz. I can remember, and I think frequently about when I think about black magic, and I think about the practitioners of magic. So like when I was reading I think it's called The Golden Bough, that seminal work of comparative mythology. There was this Ayurvedic black wizard, and he said that he was so powerful, that his mind magic was so powerful that he could just look at someone and then 24 hours later they would die. And I remember that claim, thinking about it like an American and being like, yeah, okay. And then since then, because before then I didn't really engage with 20th and 19th century adventure fiction, but since then I've engaged with a lot of 19th and 20th century adventure fiction, that stuff that set the foundation for the Indiana Jones type stuff. Like, that set the foundation for Indiana Jones is what I guess I mean. But black magic, tribal black wizards are a thing, and I mentioned earlier and then dropped the thread to think about something else, that, you know, liberals love the Native Americans, and so, like, they want to draw on, like, misunderstood Native American mythology or Native American spiritual science, really, when they say, like, that the current trans surgeries have basis in Native American third spirit, or whatever they say it's called. So let's talk a little bit about Native American magic then, in the context of, like, tribal magic, because we're talking. I brought up the idea of Western skeptics ripping the curtain or the veil off of this Indian wizard, or I set up this Ayurvedic wizard like a skeptic was going to do that. In fact, because a skeptic did do that, challenged him to it on television, and of course he failed. And there's this glee there, this, haha, we told you that what you knew, you didn't actually know, and there's a good reason for that. And it's an ugly reason that I don't like. So that's why I didn't join the scientific skeptic cult. That, and, you know, all of the rape, or at least all of the crying wolf about sexual misconduct in the community. Because the humanities really did try science, before this most recent takeover of the sciences. If you listen to people like Jordan Peterson, they really did try the sciences first. It just took a lot longer to conquer the sciences than I shouldn't say the sciences, I should say STEM. It took a lot longer for the humanities and the whole woke ideology to start to win regularly in STEM, because there were just fewer non-white, non-males in that community. So it was easier to dismiss them, or it was easier to unmask the frauds who were claiming sexual misconduct or racial discrimination. But in certain Native American, let's say, mythical systems, or scientific systems is a better way. Maybe Gnostic systems would be a good way to say it if I was trying to be really ironic and a real dickhead. But they have this idea of what's been popularized now as skinwalkers. Skinwalkers, right? You know, the Skinwalker Ranch made it very, very popular, the idea. And for good reason. They're trying to make money out there. But the basic idea, whether this is true to the Apache or whatever, the Native American, I don't think it's Apache, the Native American tradition or not, is the idea that they're black wizards. They're individual shamans, right, who through some compact with some evil entity made themselves infinitely powerful. And so, in a way, what we're talking about when we're talking about infinitely powerful, we're talking about extending your campfire infinitely, right, to expand everything. But see, the thing with black magic and the thing with shamanism isn't that your personal campfire is expansive to everything. It's that you are in compact with an entity of the campfire. So it is everything, and you are in compact with it, somehow either able to command it because you dominated it, or able to get it to do things for you because you have a reciprocal relationship with it. And so I brought up the Aztec and how, the Christians were appalled by all that human sacrifice, and it's hard to justify all that human sacrifice. Well, all that human sacrifice was intentionally done in the name of black magic. The god that they were sacrificing all of those people to was the evil god. So if we're talking about in the context of, I've brought up Zarathustra and Zoroastrianism and Indo-European proto-religion a lot. So if we're talking in the context of the evil god, we're talking in the context of the Angra Mainyu, the opposite of Ahura Mazda. So if there's this infinite good, there's also this infinite bad, right? And so if you can extrapolate out, like the yin and the yang, that there's goodness, and whether it's a force or a material entity or just an abstracted concept, there are things that are good, and then there must necessarily be badness, because there are things, there are, whether they be entities or ideas, which are bad. So like, the thought of getting sick is bad, and therefore the thought of getting sick is evil to you. So thinking the thought, I might get sick, according to Zoroastrianism, is unright or unrighteous thought, right? And so what you want to do is have white or good or clean or righteous thoughts. And so you don't think bad things like, I might get sick, or the sky might fall. You think good things like, I won't get sick, and the sky won't fall. And it's about worldview. It's about framing your thoughts, right? And so AAVE doesn't have philosophical thoughts like this, because it's a proto-civilization. It's a new civilization trying to give birth to itself in the middle of another civilization. And so what it's trying to do is it's trying to cobble together DNA from other civilizations. And when that happens, you get medieval Europe. And do we really want medieval Europe in our inner cities in the United States? Like, is that really our end goal? Like, everyone agrees that medieval Europe isn't what you want. Everyone agrees that. Everyone agrees that medieval Europe sucks. Like, now to the point that we can't look at medieval Europe and go, wow, it would suck to live then, and we have it great. What we have to do is, it actually wasn't even that interesting. Which blows my fucking mind. Well, it blows my mind like a shotgun blast to the head from these people's mouths. It doesn't upset me. It does. It's upsetting. But it doesn't upset me, and it's not something that's unsurprising. The reason it blows my mind like a shotgun blast to the head is that they're saying that they don't want to learn the lessons of history, so history itself must be stupid. The concept of studying history must be stupid, which is so insane to hear a history student or a history fan, or I'm thinking about this person who was advertising a podcast saying, no, knighthood and the Middle Ages were dumb actually, and let's talk about that. And it's just a refusal to learn from the past, which is just amazing. People that want to talk about the past who don't know the first lesson of the past, which is if you don't learn from it, you repeat it. So by going, these people were dumb, and as a prerequisite of not learning from their mistakes, we're just going to say the whole practice of studying them is dumb. Which is where we're at with our school system. So like AAVE is, and the people that are insisting that AAVE is a language, these 10 or 15 people maybe, are the same people that are telling you that your children don't need to learn math, they don't need to know how to write by hand, and they don't need to know how to comprehend what they read. Because again, language, mathematics is a language, and reading is the consumption of language in the quiet and over the long term of contemplation on a single idea. Or at least a single person's ideation. Single author, even if, I don't know, you can have multiple authors on a piece, but you're still focusing on the one idea, the one thing that's being communicated. So you're doing language. And so a language that can only communicate with itself and people who already know it is paradoxical, because like English that's written down in the 18th century is idiosyncratic to English that's written down in the 18th century. Reading it as a 21st century person is a work of effort to extrapolate what they're trying to say and to comprehend the meaning behind the person. And so this insistence that this non-language is a language and that you don't need to actually know how to comprehend what you read, because all that you need to know how to read is the basic instructions to prepare your food or to order it. Everyone suffers. This insistence that there be a separate but higher bar in the game of limbo, so a separate but lower bar in the game of high jump or pole vault, which is how that phrase is actually used. For black people, it's not just not fair, it's detrimental to black people, but it's detrimental to the whole society, because if you have to give jobs to unqualified people because of a characteristic that neither of you has any control over, everyone suffers. Everyone suffers. And so, in antiquity, this was why only the Aryans, only the nobility, and only the male nobility, and then only the male nobility who had survived combat, and only the male nobility who had survived leading combat, were allowed to vote if a vote was allowed, because usually only one of those persons survived long enough to be that person, and that person was called the king. Because he was the best of our kind, the best of our kin. He was the highest atop the totem pole because he was the greatest abstraction of us. He was the only person with enough actual empirical experience to have a fucking opinion about anything. Or at least to know how to derive an opinion from the wisdom of the people giving him information. Because that's equally important. And so if you're leaders that are telling you, oh no, speak this degenerate incommunicative language, if they're the people that sit atop the totem pole or atop the pyramid in this particular example of your people, but they don't speak that language, what's really happening? You're being enslaved. It's slavery. It's a slave tongue. And there's something to be said for remembering your history, but there's another thing entirely to be said for ritually living out your history, ritually repeating your history. And so I have an example, but I would like to give a second example, a different example. So there's the harmful example of ritually living out your history in post-Holocaust Jewish schools, Hebrew schools, where they ritually relive the Holocaust. And so they have these kids ritually relive what it was like to be in the internment camps. And they have these teachers who cruelly, ritually pretend to be Nazi guards to ritually inculcate that feeling of being an oppressed people, even when you're not, is a bad example of ritually living out your past. But humans have been ritually reliving our pasts to inculcate the good of our society as long as we've been doing anything. So if that's the black magic, right? The unwilling sacrifice of children for the personal empowerment of the ritual actor, which is what I'm describing when I'm describing these people that encourage you to speak AAVE by not speaking the language. That's an unwilling or unwitting sacrifice for the personal empowerment of these people sitting atop the black culture pyramid. And really, again, it's like 15 people. It's a very, very small number of people. And it's really not Jay-Z and the other people that were really popular circa 2010, 2012 really, as Illuminati members. The Black Illuminati is a hilarious misdirection of who's actually in control of your culture. White magic is explaining why we speak the language the way we do. And so universities and churches used to be where the white magic was taught and where the white wizards were created. Our universities are not where the white wizards are taught and where they're created anymore. That hasn't been the case for a long time. I keep losing my thread because everything that I say, I have to explain out, and then I don't remember why I'm explaining out. It's such an abstract, it's so hard to talk about this thing in a systematic way, like a scientist would. It's because it's impossible to pick a single level it's impossible to pick a single level of abstraction, because I'm trying to show that this totem pole or this pyramid is broken, that the energy sequence doesn't flow all the way through it, but like it's not a single energy sequence. Like no energy sequence is made up of like no like your alternating current within your electric wires. We know that that's not one electron, right? Like it's not like an electron that's going in the computer or whatever that's plugged into the wall is eating that electron. I don't really understand the process. I guess it's like changing the polarity of the electron, and then the electron is going back to the power plant to be turned into the proper polarity, but the electron isn't consumed. And so like the energy and the threads that make up these things, they're not consumed by the things. So like there are a nearly infinitude of ways and a nearly infinitude of examples that I could show you that this language and that the people that are telling you to speak it and that are telling you to adopt this worldview are enslaving you. They are making your life more difficult for you, but also for the people in your immediate vicinity to understand you. For you, they're making it more difficult for you to communicate, not just like big ideas, they're making it difficult, near impossible for you to communicate your basic emotions. And like if you can't communicate your basic emotions, you're basically a shut-in. And if you're a shut-in, you're traumatizing yourself every time you speak. And so a good example of ritual, this is what I wanted to talk about. So you're ritually traumatizing yourself every time you use AAVE. Ritually traumatizing yourself. Ritually reminding yourself of that your people, whether your people were or were not, were slaves. And the only people who know they're slaves are people who are told that they're slaves. And the only people who don't like being slaves are people who know they're slaves. So if you don't know that you're being enslaved by your language and by your worldview, you don't know that you should not like it. So in a lot of ways, I'm a white savior. I'm not allowed to do this anymore. But see, just because my skin is white doesn't mean that I have a white education. I didn't have a university education. I was a D student. I think my GPA was like a 2.2. I basically dropped out of high school. I just got a diploma. Because you can do that. You can do that now. And why shouldn't you? If the vernacular English, whether it be African American or whether it be Southern or whether it be whatever it be, if the vernacular English, if you're told, well, vernacular English is good enough, and grade school math is good enough, and Sunday school religion is good enough, and what you learn by the time you're 18 is good enough for you to be a fully functional, already all the way developed individual, they're not doing it for you. Because you're not. your brain isn't even fully developed. Your frontal lobe, your ability to make decisions for yourself, your ability to test reality isn't even fully developed until you're 25. 25. And so the argument is, well, why are we allowed to fight wars at 18, right? Why do we send these poor black kids to die at 18, right? But they're not allowed to smoke cigarettes in certain parts of the country, and they're not allowed to smoke weed, and they're not allowed to drink. They're not allowed to make the decision to rent a car, or is it car insurance? Something like that is 21 or 23 or some arbitrary number like that. I think it's rent a car, right? There all these things that are barred from you, like you can't serve in the Congress until you're in your whatever. Maybe there's no limit on how old you have to be to serve in government, but you can't be a president until it's whatever 38 or 40 or 45 or whatever. There are these arbitrary age restrictions, and then young people. I very distinctly remember being 18, being young, and being around people who didn't have college educations and didn't have parents with college educations who were going, but why, but why, but why, but why, about all these things, right? And protesting and saying, oh, our government is letting us down because it's not giving us the answers to these things. But it's like, governments didn't used to have to give answers to children. Adults didn't have to tell children why. My dad used to slap me across the face if I asked the question why. He'd be like, do this thing. And if I said, but why not do it this way? I didn't even get the knot out of my mouth before he was slapping me across the face. And I was a scrawny small boy, and he was not a small person. But that wasn't my father being unethical. That wasn't my father being a bad person. That was my father having a short temper and no patience and no ability to communicate because he didn't have an education in language. So he didn't know how to communicate his emotions, and he didn't know how to communicate his whys. So there is something to be learned there beyond just that asking the question why comes with being slapped across the face. But here's the other thing. Asking the question why comes with being slapped across the face. Whether it be literally because your father or the person in power that you're asking but why slaps you across the face, or with the slap across the face that is metaphorical of not getting an answer, because it's nobody's responsibility to answer you why but you. The answers are self-evident because they were determined 5,000 or 7,000 years ago, probably longer, probably a lot longer than that. We figured out the answers to why we have to speak in a good, functional language, and why we have to be compassionate to one another, and why we have to treat people who look different than us with respect. I'm not Indian and I can't speak to the caste system, but there is a respect between the classes. Respect. It's maybe not liking, and it's maybe not dignity, but you know your role, and you treat the people that aren't your role with respect, except for maybe the untouchables or whatever. But untouchable or pariah people are untouchable and pariah for a reason. So let's talk about that. Why am I untouchable and pariah for saying these things, and why would it have been necessary, or why would it have been good to... I still haven't given my good example of ritual magic, but why would it have been good to ostracize or make me a pariah? Because that's more important than the good ritual magic to me. If I've got an idea or if I've got this intellectual pathogen, I've got this idea, and I tell it to the wrong people whose campfires are dwarfed by mine, and they believe me, and I'm wrong, I can destroy civilization. One person, one black wizard can in fact destroy civilization. The reason that skinwalkers were such a threat is because they through their selfishness, whether it be real people doing this thing or conceptually, like the Wendigo, right? The cannibalistic, the monster that is the personification of winter cannibalism among Canadian natives. Or I guess extreme North American natives. whether it's real or not, these things are evil and they're personified as monsters, right? Skin shifters, these skinwalkers who can turn into bears and wolves, but they're huge and terrifying, right? These things are representations of what selfishness actually does. It turns you into a monster. It turns you into a devouring monster that hurts the people around you, whether you want to or not. Like we talk about alcohol. Like, what is alcohol? Well, alcohol is it's self-abuse. And when you self-abuse long enough, you overfill the cup of self-abuse and you abuse the people around you, because it becomes habitual to abuse yourself. And once you make a thing habitual to do to you, it's just the next thing to do it to other people. So, by that sense, like the right thoughts, right speech, right action is self-evidently true, because if you have unright thought, you'll speak unrightly, and then if you speak unrightly, you'll do unrightly, and if you do and speak and think wrong, just an error, you're hurting people. So, like, everybody is making a big deal right now about, like, 3 Mile Island, I think is what it's called. This, near nuclear meltdown in American history. And so, like, if you take the idea that what happened was this one valve wasn't closed or wasn't opened properly and left overnight, and we say that thinking, speaking, and acting unrightly, or just saying something, just being in error, an accidental error, the person who was responsible for turning that valve, if they thought that they had turned it correctly, and they told someone that they had turned it correctly, and they acted on having thought that and having said that they turned it correctly, that is, not going back to double check that they had in fact turned it correctly, if you do those 3 steps, you have a nuclear meltdown that could result in, hundreds of thousands or millions of deaths and a permanent irradiation of the planet. We're talking about, like, Chernobyl, right? So, like, Chernobyl is the result of one person's wrong thought, wrong speech, and wrong action. We agree on that. And so it doesn't have to be, like, it doesn't have to be this big abstraction where you're like Hitler and you're like, well, you tell enough small lies and people will believe big ones. That is what I'm talking about, but it doesn't have to be big and insidious like that. It doesn't have to be terrifying. It's just in your own life. If you think that street light is green and you tell yourself in your mind that street light is green and you act on that street light being green when it is in fact red because you didn't observe the other dangers around you, you put yourself in extreme danger, at extreme risk. And so, like, the self-evident don't do black magic is self-evident and doesn't need to be explained to children. And in fact, children who ask why should be hit, metaphorically speaking. They should understand that it's dangerous and will result in pain, because if they don't, they will never learn it and they become Democrats. And I'm not being funny. A good example of ritual white magic, and I loathe to use this example because you're going to rebel against it, is passion plays. Remembering the Last Supper, or remembering Jesus' sacrifice on the cross, right? I'm not a practicing Christian, but those are white magic rituals because they remind you of something bigger and better than yourself. They remind you of a history that connects you through time to people who were better than you. And one of the things that I notice when I hear students, black students in particular, speak is they compare themselves to Civil War heroes from the 60s and 70s, the 80s and 90s, but they're 18. You're not a Civil War hero. You haven't fought in battle. You haven't led others fighting in battle. You don't know anything. In fact, I would argue that you can't know anything before 25, and that you shouldn't be allowed to vote. But then you ask, well, why should I be allowed to die? Well, the only people who then should be allowed to die are the people who did put themselves in the position to die. The only people who should be allowed to vote are the people who put themselves in position to die. Because they're the only people who are actually invested in things staying good. Because when we insist that it should be better, what we mean is it should be better for me. That's why the conversation with presidents, especially with incumbent presidents during the debates, is always, is it better for you now than it was 4 years ago? For you now, not for the country. Is it better for you? And the conversation used to be, are you making more money? Right? Because, if we're Howard Zinn, we can say, well, that's because they were only asking out of racism, because they were only asking the rich people. But the people that they were actually asking was the poor people, which included black people, included Mexicans, included Chinese, included Irish, included Scottish, included Germans, included Jews, right? Poor people is who they were asking. What they were asking is, in the last 4 years, did you or anyone you know escape poverty? That was what the question was. And if the answer wasn't yes, it was time to try someone else. Because the question and the answer used to be, do you have an equal opportunity if you become white to escape the blackness of poverty? Or the poverty of blackness? The poverty of ignorance. Because you can be fabulously wealthy and destitute in ignorance. A fool and his money are parted every day. That's why in English we're so skeptical of people like me. I said that. Didn't Black Lives Matter prove to us that a fool and his money are parted every day? Didn't Reverend Jesse Jackson, prove to us that a fool and his money are parted every day? Hasn't every single black pop star, from the guy in the Rat Pack all the way up to Jay-Z, every single black pop star proven that a fool and his money are parted? Black sports stars. Isn't that the lesson that growing up black teaches us? I grew up in a black community. I grew up poor, the poorest possible. The only way that we could have been any more poor was to not have running water, and my mother made sure of that about every third month. So, isn't the lesson that having inaccurate speech, inaccurate thoughts, and inaccurate actions, I know I didn't say those in the right order, but I am talking about AAVE. Isn't the lesson of being black, and I don't mean having black skin, I mean being poor, being ignorant, isn't the lesson of having once been ignorant, isn't the lesson of being woke that you aren't woke until you're awake?